Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Jasper Machogu. Jasper is an agricultural engineer, a small scale farmer based in rural Kenya, and an advocate for fossil fuels for Africa. I've found Jasper on Twitter a few months ago, and I've enjoyed his discussions on a topic that we've discussed quite often here in this podcast, which is hydrocarbon fuels and their essential role in modern life. And he brings in a very useful perspective because usually we're surrounded by people who tell you how they want to get rid of hydrocarbon fuels, how the hydrocarbon fuels are evil. But here we have somebody who doesn't have enough hydrocarbon fuels in his life, and he relates his experience to people who have a lot of hydrocarbon fuels. And I think it is an extremely valuable experience for people to learn about. And also, he's been talking about the situation, the political situation in Kenya. And some of you might have heard there's been all kinds of political unrest there. And I believe this is also quite relevant to the topics that we discuss in the podcast here, related to international organizations like the IMF and the debt slavery they put countries in. So I look forward to discussing all of this with you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jasper.
Thank you for having me, Saifedean.
All right, so tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, how you became an agricultural engineer, and what made you interested in the topic of fossil fuels in particular.
Okay, so I'm a farmer from rural Kenya, a small scale farmer actually, and I have a background in agricultural engineering. I have a bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering, which is basically the physics behind agriculture. And anyway, so I used to be, I wouldn't want to refer myself as a Greenpeace member because I've seen Greenpeace like they don't like that. So, but I used to volunteer with them and another group called Let's Do It Kenya back in 2019, 2018, and 2020 partly. So, in one of those cleanup activities, because we used to go to various towns and do cleanup activities, mostly polythene, and I used to like dislike, like I felt humans were cancer on this earth. Like we were polluting the environment, we were hurting it, impacting it in negative ways. So somehow, like I really was in a bad place, I'd say, because I've come to to know better. Anyway, so in one of those cleanup activities, I realized that we were basically collecting plastics. Like we went to a slum and we were collecting plastics, polythene papers, and when I went back home, I realized that these things enabled people to live affordably, cheaply, because the poor people, like you go buy milk, you don't need a container. You're not going to get milk from a supermarket. You're going to buy milk from a milk vendor or along the street. So this person is going to pour the milk in a polythene paper or a plastic container. If you want shoes for your kids, you're going to buy the $1 pair of shoes from China, basically plastic. So plastics enable these people, the poor people, to live cheaply. Anyway, so I went back home and I was thinking about that at the same time I was looking up Greenpeace because like I wanted to be a serious member of Greenpeace. And I came to realize that one of the co-founders of Greenpeace was no longer Greenpeace member, Dr. Patrick Moore. And that got me like, how would you found such a beautiful group which cares about the environment and people and leave it? So upon reading more on whatever Patrick Moore had to say and why he left, I came to realize that he had a book out uh, um, by the name uh, Fake. The Can I remember the name right now?
Invisible catastrophes and fake threats,
Fake
or something
Threat
like
of
that.
Doom. Yes.
Fake threats of doom, yeah.
Yeah. So I read the book, and after that, I realized like most of whatever I knew was basically propaganda. It was the alarmist narrative. So after that, I realized that okay, so Africans need fossil fuels. By the way, like I'm a farmer, machines would really be beneficial to me. Fertilizer will be beneficial to me because I have done organic farming back in 2020. I was in our farm in Molo in the Rift Valley, and I was doing organic farming, beans. I was growing beans organically, like no fertilizer, I was basically pouring in manure, no spraying of pesticides, nothing, fungicides, nothing. Basically, like purely organic. Yeah. So 2 years down the line, I'm here. I'm saying fossil fuels for Africa.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to cure people from these ideas because ultimately people have this image in their mind. I think wherein I liken it to thinking of fossil fuels or hydrocarbons as being similar to the color of your iPhone. That they're just out there complaining, demanding that Apple make iPhones green, and they're not happy about the fact that Apple only makes iPhones in white and black. And so, if we just talk to the right person in Apple, then we'll stop having white and black iPhones, and then they'll give us the green iPhones, and then everything will be better. But that's a really superficial thing. The color of the iPhone is completely tangential and irrelevant to its performance. The use of hydrocarbon fuels is not a tangential detail. It's a completely essential part of the operation of those things. And so the reality is, if you try and produce things without hydrocarbons, productivity is a lot lower. So people use hydrocarbons because productivity is a lot lower, is a lot higher when you use hydrocarbons, and that makes life so much better. So how do you? I mean, give us a kind of vivid, uh, on the ground feel for how life is different, or how it would be better if you had more hydrocarbons. So, as a farmer, what difference does it make for you?
So let me try to paint a picture of how we live over here. So I come from a community whereby kids, children, mostly during weekends, they either washing their clothes along the river, or maybe they're fetching firewood, or they're doing both. Most people actually on weekends they washing their clothing, and we do the hand washing. So from Monday to Friday, it's work day, and we usually, most people out here in my community, about 95%, actually more than 95% of my community earn a livelihood from agriculture, or they engage in agriculture. And so you realize that these people wake up very early in the morning, maybe 6 in the morning. They prepare, maybe cook some tea using firewood. They go to their farms. They maybe do weeding, plucking tea, uh, harvesting finger millet, harvesting maize, whatever it is. It's done manually. Like you depend on your muscle to do work, to perform work, to produce food, to feed your family, to earn a livelihood. Everything is done manually. So that's from Monday to Friday. We have people fetching water from 600 meters away. In some other places, people are fetching water from 1 kilometer away. You carry a 20-liter bucket. That's basically 20 kilos of weight on your head or on your shoulders. Uphill, that's something that people do over here from day to day. So I realize, okay, so in sub-Saharan Africa today, you realize that about almost 90% of our energy is coming from burning biomass. Biomass is a fancy term for charcoal, firewood, crop residue, and cow dung. Like, that's where we get most of our energy from. And so when I hear people say what Africa needs is solar and wind, I really wonder if these people really care about us. So if we wanted today to better the lives of 6 to 7 out of 10 lives of these Africans, because this, okay, 60 to 70% of the African population, they are in agriculture, or they depend on agriculture for livelihood. 60 to 70%. So if we wanted to better 6 to 7 out of 10 lives of these Africans, one of the easiest ways for us to do that is by improving agriculture. How do we improve agriculture? By one, availing farm machines to these people. So we have the UN. Let me start with the UN. So we have the UN. The UN plays a big role in our policies. They literally control our governments. They're the big people, the big person in the picture, the UN. So whatever the UN says or whatever policies they push to our governments are most likely going to embrace them. So the UN came to Africa. They did this beautiful research, and they realized that out of okay, so we have 17 problems, 16 plus climate change, and out of these problems, they came up with solutions for the problems. But the problem is the sustainability part of in the SDGs, in the Sustainable Development Goals, the sustainable bit literally says no use of fossil fuels. It's tied to climate change. So solving every other problem, solving every other problem is literally tied to, you know, no use of fossil fuels, or let's conserve the environment, let's protect the planet somehow. So it's really sad because that basically means we cannot use our fossil fuels. We continue burning biomass for energy, and that is really really sad because so today we have about out of all of the people in the world who don't have access to clean cooking, 50% are in Africa. 83% of all the people in the world minus electricity who don't have access to electricity are in Africa. We are an energy poor continent. Today, an average African is using the amount of energy. So let me start with, so I think you know Vaclav Smil, the energy historian. So he documents that today the average African is consuming about the amount of energy a person in Germany or France was consuming in 1860. 1860. If we increased our energy consumption by 10 times, we're going to reach the amount of energy the same person was consuming in 1970. That's after we multiply our energy consumption by 10 times. That is really crazy. Today, my family, I come from a family. We are 6 people, four siblings, 3 siblings plus I four, and then my mom and dad. 6 people. We consume the amount of electricity. So we consume about 12 to 16 kilowatt hours a month, 12 to 16 units a month. An American refrigerator consumes 45 units a month. It's crazy. Anyway, so we want to better the lives of Africans. Let's improve agriculture. How do we do that? So we have farm machines. Depending on our muscle to earn a livelihood or to produce food or to do whatever doesn't make sense at all. This is the 21st century and we have machines working for other people. Why should it be they working for us? A good example is a combine harvester. A combine harvester does a lot of work. It substitutes literally like 1,000 people. In 1 minute, the combine harvester is going to cut the heads of, let's say, wheat. It's going to thresh the wheat. It's going to pack the wheat. It's going to winnow the wheat, and then it's going to pack the wheat. I have my mom over here going to the farm. She's weeding our finger millet manually. Finger millet is just, it's grown like wheat. So she's weeding our finger millet manually. She has to kneel down and find the weeds, look at the weeds, and separate the weeds from the finger millet. That is a hard task to do. And then during the harvesting, she's using a knife. She holds the head and then she cuts the head. She does that from probably most of the time 8 in the morning to like 4 or 5 in the evening, depending with if it rained or if it didn't. That's a lot of hard work. So we need farm machines. And by the way, today, if so in Africa, we have about 4 to 5% of our farm operations mechanized. If you go to a place like India, about 45%. If you go to China, about 75%. If you go to the US, about 95%, almost 100%. And that's why we have the US being one of the largest agricultural producers in the world today, despite the fact that only 2% of their population are in agriculture. Only 2%. The 2% feed their people. And now the US has got even like 75% more or abundant food. Like that's food they don't need. 75% more. And we have Africans over here, 60-70% in agriculture, and yet we can't feed ourselves. So number two, okay, so the machines are made by steel. Steel is made using fossil fuels, and lots of plastics. Plastics is fossil fuels, and the farm machines. There is no way to power the farm machines using electricity. There is no way. John Deere says that there is no way you can power. Actually, they give out like so. One of their engineers said in 2022, I think. So they said they have the 8R machine. It's a big machine. So they said that if they were to electrify that, if they were to put instead of the ICE engine, they put batteries. The 8R machine is going to be the battery itself is going to be twice the 8R machine. So you can imagine that. So there is no way to electrify farm machines at the moment. So number two, we need okay. Number one, I said farm machines. Number two, we need fertilizer. Actually, fertilizer should have been number one because that's one of the easiest ways for us to improve agriculture in Africa. So today we have an average African consuming so little fertilizer, so little. What the crops need is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That is it. Those are the macronutrients. So Africans today are consuming so little nitrogenous fertilizer, about 5% of the total nitrogenous fertilizer consumed worldwide, despite the fact that we have about 18% of the world population. So if you came to Africa today, we consume about 20 kilos of fertilizer per hectare. Go to a place like the US. The US is consuming about 100 to 120 kilos of fertilizer per hectare. Go to EU, green EU that's preaching green hydrogen and solar and wind to African nations. Go to their countries, they consume about 270 kilos per hectare of fertilizer. Go to India, 250 kilos. Go to China, 360 kilos per hectare. Africans, 20 kilos per hectare. That's how much fertilizer we consume today per hectare. That is so little. So little. That's why if you look at our production today, we're producing about 2 tons of corn per hectare. That is the production for an American farmer in like 1800 or something. That's 2 tons per hectare. That's what an American farmer was producing in 1800. Today, an American farmer is producing 11 to 12 tons of corn per hectare. And it's so simple. We need fertilizer. That is it. So number three, we need irrigation. Irrigation. We can't have irrigation minus fossil fuels. We need the pumps. The pumps are usually made from steel, fossil fuels. We need the irrigation structures. The irrigation structures usually like polythene or steel poles, and we need the piping. Piping we can't have piping minus fossil fuels. The piping is mostly plastics, and we can desalinate ocean water because we have nations nearing the Sahara Desert, so we can desalinate ocean water. We can as well drill boreholes. We can do drilling of boreholes minus fossil fuels. Number four, value addition. Value addition is going to be a game changer. We shouldn't be sending our value to these Western countries. We shouldn't. So a country like Ghana sends its cocoa to Germany or France or Italy for those countries to roast the cocoa and then sell it as chocolate. It's so simple. But then when you look at the profits realized by the people in Ghana, it's so little. But there was a research, I think, back in 2015. The research said that out of the profits realized from selling cocoa, about 2% went to the Ghanaian farmers. The rest went to these big corporations. So we literally exporting value to these countries. And if we had industries over here whereby we'd add value to whatever products, farm products we produced, we wouldn't have a big unemployment cases in Africa. And we can't industrialize minus fossil fuels. That is very clear from a good example from factories in Kisii, in let me say tea factories in Kenya. So about 2 years ago, there was a research, and it said that so we have tea factories. Actually, tea factories over here burn a lot of firewood uh, for the processing of tea, and about 90% of the energy that these tea factories consume is from biomass, firewood, literally. Only 10% is from electricity, powering computers and lighting. But when you look at the cost of the energy costs, when it's broken down, about 60% goes to paying for the electricity. 40%, only 40% covers for the biomass. So biomass it's cheaper. And I think that's because Kenyan electricity is expensive because we're chasing the solar and wind fantasies, the green alarmist narrative. And we have one of the worst presidents ever. Like this guy is being invited to these big meetings, is talking about climate change. Like whenever EU has got a
We're gonna
big
get to your president. We're gonna get to your president, but let's stick to hydrocarbons for a minute. Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course. Go to saifedean.com and sign up now. Okay, so you said a lot there, and I think this is really good. I'm going to just try and recap some of the most important things you said. The real reason you think that hydrocarbon fuels would be very important for Africa: number one, farm machinery and energy for farm machinery; number two, fertilizer; and number three, irrigation. And I think those are very important points. And it's something that most people, I think, in the West take for granted. That they just think, well, I go buy my food from the organic store, or I go to the farmer's market, and so they imagine there's just this cute farmer and his wife and kids who wake up every morning and make your little strawberries and make your little grains and stuff. And then they process them and they bake them with their hands with love into bread. And then you just buy the bread. But realistically, that's not how it works. And even if it is a small scale organic operation, it's only made possible because the people running that operation have enormous amounts of energy at their disposal for irrigation, for machines, and for fertilizer. Even if they don't use fertilizer, they will still be using irrigation and machinery. And that's what makes all of this farming possible. What I found really amazing, and this is something that yeah, I mean, I've developed very radical ideas about climate change and all of those things. But even before um, I'll just say it. I've said it before, but like I don't really think that there is a climate crisis. I don't think climate change is a problem that we need to be concerned with. But even when I thought that it was a problem, even when I was studying in graduate school and convinced that this is the most serious problem in the world, I found it extremely, extremely, extremely troubling to see just how this was normalized, this idea that we need to stop Africans from accessing these energy sources, because if they access them, if you have a billion Africans who are living at the same kind of energy footprint that Europeans have, then we're going to have serious problems in the world. We're going to have serious problems with energy production, with carbon dioxide. We're going to have environmental crises. And so, therefore, it's essential for the sake of the planet that Africans develop in a sustainable way, which means that they shouldn't have access to all these reliable forms of energy. Instead, they should develop the, their industry, their agriculture, and their life around these swings and slides, as I like to call them, the joke play sources of energy that only people in the West can afford to pretend that they are relying on, which is solar and wind and biofuels. Because when you have a nuclear power plant and when you have enormous amounts of hydrocarbon energy, then you're able to engage in something so silly as building a wind generation farm to connect to your grid, which is going to make your electricity more expensive. It's going to reduce the reliability of your grid. But if you're extremely rich and you have nuclear and gas plants, then you can get away with doing something like this. But they then think that you could just give Africans the same quality of life as Europeans or Americans by just having them run on these unreliable, intermittent sources of energy that cannot really meet the demand for reliable food production or for all kinds of energy consumption that we as human beings need. And I just find this so startling. And I think it's not entirely innocent. So I think a lot of people think that it is possible. A lot of people just don't really understand the thermodynamics involved. They think, okay, well, we could just, instead of investing in building a gas or oil or coal plant for power in Kenya, the Kenyan government should just build solar farms and wind farms, and then that will be better and that will be cheaper because wind and solar have free fuel. You don't have to pay for their fuel, whereas the gas plants, the coal plants, you need to keep buying gas and coal, and then you're just going to get electricity. But of course, it's completely different. It doesn't work that way. So I think a part of it is innocent, not understanding, but I think there is a deeper, more sinister agenda here, which is that it's not a coincidence that the same people that are telling you that it's going to be a problem for Africans to have this kind of technology, now they're saying it's because of climate change. But 50 years ago, the same people were saying it was a problem because of running out of resources. The earth is overpopulated. There's too many people on earth. There are too many Africans. They're breeding too fast. And we need to prevent this from getting out of hand. And the way to prevent this from getting out of hand is to make sure that they don't have a lot of resources, because if they have resources, they're going to, I don't know, finish up all of the oil for us, and then there won't be any oil left, which is completely ridiculous because oil is so ridiculously abundant on Earth. Oil, coal, and gas. We just keep finding more and more and more. The more we consume, the more we find. So we're not running out of it. And I think it's also, I mean, it's pernicious, but it's also very stupid because realistically, the what history shows is that as people have better quality of life, and as they can have better likelihood of their children surviving childhood, then they end up having fewer kids. It's sort of the other way around. If you look historically, when societies get rich, people start having fewer kids. And I think a good explanation for this is that when you are very poor, you need to have a lot of kids because A, you don't have energy sources that allow you to do work. So you want to have kids to do more and more work for you. And B, because you're, well, I mean, A is also because you're poor. So the kind of work that you need is manual, heavy work. And so children can help with that at age 4, 5, 6. They start moving things around and carrying things around. So then it makes sense to have more and more kids if you're poor because that's free labor. Whereas on the other hand, if and the other aspect of it is that if children are expected to die young, then you need to overcompensate by having more and more. Some of them will survive until adulthood, but that goes away as the quality of life increases. First of all, kids stop being slave labor for you and they start becoming human beings that you need to teach and feed and clothe and give them their own life. And so then it becomes more expensive to have kids, and then you don't think of them as assets. You start thinking of them more as liabilities, and so you have fewer kids. So it is, even by their very evil uh, depopulationist agenda, it is it is kind of counterproductive to be doing this because th- there's just nothing better than letting people have the choices that they want in their own life with how they want to live their lives. Would you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree. And that is very evident in my community. Like, if you ask people around, the older generation, the ones who had like so a family, the older generation that I'm talking about, like dad's my dad's dad. So my dad has got like 8 siblings, 9 siblings. My mom has got like 6 siblings. But if you look at them now, my dad and mom, they have 4 kids, and that is very like, if you look around, that is just it. So back, people used to actually, like, my dad, they lost like 2 siblings. My mom lost one. Like my mom's family, and if you go back, more kids used to die. So that is not the case today, because like you have 4 kids and they're going. We are four. I have 3 siblings, and we all grew up very well. So I think that is very evident. But anyway, so I don't like whatever the WEF, the IMF, World Bank, the UN, all of these organizations, whatever they're saying. And I don't think, actually, like, Obama is one of the most anti-African people ever. So back a while back, he was addressing a youth uh, like conference in South Africa, and in that conference, the guy said, if every other African, he didn't say African, but he was addressing Africans. So if every other youth in here has got a big house, can has heating for their house, they have a car, the world is going to boil over. That is what the guy literally said. Like, that is that is so anti-African. That is so anti-humanist. Like, that is a that is something a person who doesn't. How dare he? Just like the UN had a title, had an article out by the title, "The Benefits of World Hunger," and they were saying, like, if every other person is rich, every other person is fed, this we won't have people cleaning our toilets, we won't have people mowing our lawns, we won't have people gardening, get weeding our kitchen gardens. Like, I don't even, I lack words. But at the end of the day, I think the climate agenda boils down to depopulation. Because right now, I've seen people talk about degrowth. Degrowth is a fancy term for depopulation, and that is literally it. So once you keep Africans poor, uh, people think, these organizations think that Africans are going to, because now Africans are going to have less kids, or maybe 2 kids or something of the sort, because also they are advocating for family planning methods in Africa, and they're pushing that a lot. Yeah, so I think at the same time, these people think that if Africa flourishes, if Africa starts using energy, because like the energy industry is running every other energy. Once we have uh, sorry, the energy industry runs every other industry. So once we have energy, we're going to have more industries, we're going to be richer, and we're going to need more fossil fuels. And that literally means we're going to scramble for our fossil fuels. We're going to scramble, because like today, if you look at how much oil we produce in natural gas, you realize that about 70% of oil that we produce goes outside Africa. About 40% of natural gas that we produce goes outside Africa. Our phosphate rock, we have like one of the biggest phosphate reserves in Africa, in Morocco. About 40% of that goes to EU. And anyway, so we are competing for resources. That's what that's how they feel. And I partly agree with them. So that's why they don't want us to flourish. That's why they don't want us to develop. Especially, that's why they don't want us to develop our fossil fuels.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Orange Pill app, the Bitcoin only social network that connects you with high signal Bitcoiners, events, and now merchants as well. If you're like me and can't stop talking about Bitcoin, you know how challenging it can be to talk to the no coiners and how nice it is to talk to someone who gets you. With the Orange Pill app, you can find the Bitcoiners near you and they can replace the no coiners in your life. You can organize events and meetups with local Bitcoiners, and wherever you travel, you can meet up with local Bitcoiners all while being as anonymous as you like. So if you want to build your local network of Bitcoiners, find a Bitcoin meetup or merchants accepting Bitcoin, head over to orangepillapp.com to sign up or download the app from the App Store or Google Play Store and send me a DM so we can get connected. Yeah, it's very sad. And I think this is so at this point, we're talking about it in an abstract sense, like they want us or they don't want us. But this is really very consequential in a real sense because countries like Kenya are making investments in energy infrastructure today and trying to build energy infrastructure that actually works, built on reliable fuels that are needed, like coal, gas, or oil or nuclear, is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to get financing for it. It's a lot easier to get financing for stupid solar panels and wind turbines that are extremely expensive and extremely unreliable. And we've done several discussions on this podcast for listeners who might be tuning in for one of the first times and not sure why we're saying those things. And if you have ideas about solar and wind being nice and dandy, listen to our previous podcast we've done with Alex Epstein. It's I've hosted him 2 or 3 times before on this podcast, and we discussed the problem with these kind of energy fuels, and primarily it is about their intermittence. And people think this is just a small little detail that can be fixed with batteries, but if you add batteries, you make the energy something like 10 times more expensive because batteries are really expensive and they have a short life and they run out. And without reliable and the continuous 24/7 power, then you can't run most of the things that you rely on in modern industrialization. And if you can't run those things, then you can't really have the high productivity that you need for survival. I mean, the difference is enormous, and the difference is enormous in terms of the quality of life. You cannot have a refrigerator if your refrigerator is only going to work when the sun is shining. That's going to be a pointless refrigerator. You can't just have a child's incubator if the child's incubator is only going to work when the wind is blowing. The child will die. You need uninterrupted power for the child to be alive, and therefore you can't just have a solar or wind doing that for you. You need to have a reliable form of energy where you just click a button and you don't have to worry about the weather. And this is one of the incredible and most amazing and most important achievements of industrialization, which is that it has allowed us to live our life without much concern for the weather. The average person living in an industrial society goes through their day pretty much the same thing, whether it's the middle of the winter or the middle of the summer. Only in very, very extreme events will your day be ruined or changed by the weather. Most of the days, if it's very hot, doesn't matter. You wake up, you turn on the AC, you get into your car with an AC, you go to your office with an AC, and you work all day. And it's do the same thing when it's 30, 40 degrees Celsius colder. You wake up, you turn on the heater, you get into the car, there's heating in the car. You go to your office, there's heating in the office. All along, you spend your entire day being productive at manageable temperatures. So the ability to not care about the weather and live our life is a superpower. And that's only afforded to us by reliable energy sources. And there are only four of those, really: the, coal, oil, gas, and nuclear weapon, not weapons, nuclear power. So this is how we can have nice things. If we didn't have those things, we would be back in the 15th century. That's what it really comes down to. Everything nice that we have over the last 500 years has been because of our ability to channel these enormous amounts of reliable energy continuously toward meeting our needs. Now, how is it? Are you familiar with how the government and these financial international financial institutions channel the investment in energy in a country like Kenya away from this reliable infrastructure toward unreliable wind and solar?
So what I know for sure is so last year we had I think the Chancellor of Germany, he came to Kenya and he flew to other African countries and he was talking about green hydrogen. And he he somehow or yeah somehow got these countries to invest in green hydrogen. And like our government was talking about that, like it was saying that was a great deal. The president, I think he tweeted something like the green hydrogen is going to be the future, and we're very lucky to be one of those countries that have started investing in it thanks to Germany, or whatever Germany the funds that Germany gave them. So I know for a fact that solar. Kenya today has got one of the largest wind power plants in Africa, 400 megawatts. That is so big. But look at our electricity prices. We we are paying about 16 to 20 cents. I'm talking about USD. So 16 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour compared to, let's say, the average for America, which is about 12, 13. Go to China, 10. But so we we have some of the poorest people in the world, and we are paying so heavily for electricity. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, so we have we are okay, so we are consuming so little electricity, as I told you. And even in Africa today, we're consuming about 4 to 5% of the world electricity. 4 to 5%. Look at there is a NASA picture. They took a picture of the world at night, and if you look at Africa, it's just black. It's darkness. It's covered in darkness, unlike Europe and China or Asia and the US and Canada and Australia. So the IMF and World Bank, they are not investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. They don't want Africans to develop that. If you want a loan, we're going to give you a loan. If you want a loan for energy development, we're going to give you a loan, but you should not invest in fossil fuel. You have to invest in either green hydrogen or solar and wind. Germany, that is preaching green hydrogen, you realize that. So Germany is one of those countries that has embraced solar and wind. They want to develop renewable energy infrastructure, renewable energy, renewable electricity, literally. And their solar panels work about 12% of the time. 12% of the time. So where are they getting energy from during? So about 88% of the time, they're getting that energy from burning coal. They're getting that energy from burning oil and gas. That's where they're getting their energy from. But they coming to Africa and telling us that we should embrace green hydrogen, green hydrogen. So when you look at green hydrogen, this is a fuel that. So if we were to break down hydrogen from methane versus if we were to break down the hydrogen from water, because that's what green hydrogen is. You have electricity from solar panels or something of the sort, and then you have water. You get the hydrogen, you electrolysis. So you get the hydrogen from the water, the hydrogen molecule from water. You realize that that consumes about 7 times more energy. It's expensive. And then containing Africans in Kenya, we don't have the technology to contain hydrogen, because hydrogen is the hydrogen molecule is one of the tiniest molecule to ever exist. The tiniest. Containing that is something we cannot do, because like we lack the technology. So we're literally producing the hydrogen for Germany, because Germany has decided that they're going to tone down on their fossil fuel consumption. So they are forcing poor countries to get hydrogen for them. Anyway, we don't. So when we lack funding to develop our fossil fuels, that is number one. Number two, we have the green NGOs, these big organizations like Greenpeace and the UN funding activists to say, leave African fossil fuels in the ground. A good example is whatever is happening in Uganda, the ECOP. We have paid activists, the given platform, they've flown from country to country. Other activists, like we have a Ugandan activist going all the way to Italy to tell Total not to invest in ECOP. And this lady is literally living there. So these people, like, they're given the best treatment. You fly first class. You live, okay, first class or business class. You live in five-star hotels. You getting funding. You literally, the only thing you have to do is carry a poster up and say stop EACOP or climate change or climate action or something of the sort. So yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think it's very very significant, this point, which most people don't seem to factor into the analysis. In other words, people will say, "Well, clearly these are poor countries, and so therefore, because they're poor, they can't afford to build gigantic nuclear or coal or oil infrastructure." And that's not true, because even if you're poor, this is still much better as a business. So you don't become it doesn't become a bad investment because you're poor. It it's still a better investment because it allows you to produce cheaper electricity, and then the cheaper electricity has enormous consequences. Whereas if you build a power plant connected to solar panels or to wind turbines, you're going to produce unreliable electricity, and then in 5-10 years you're going to need massive amounts of money for rebuilding it. So you would think on a free market the reliable energy would be cheaper and it would be invested in. But there is a huge distortion taking place, which is because of these financial institutions, the international financial institutions, which basically control the economies in poor countries, because they come and override all the rules of economics because they have a money printer. So it doesn't matter if you have an idea for building a coal power plant that is going to give Kenyans electricity at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and I have a crazy idea for building a solar and wind based power plants, which is going to give Kenyans electricity at 20 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's only going to work for about a third of the year or half of the year between the two of them. And is going to break down. It's going to require a lot of reinvestment. In a free market where nobody has a money printer, my idea will be built. Entrepreneurs will give me capital and I will build. No, wait, your idea, the one with hydrocarbons, is going to be built because it's going to be better economically. But in a world in which there's a money printer, and the money printer is controlled by a bunch of people who are ideologically opposed to your reliable power plant, but they support my terrible power plant, I'm going to get funding and you won't. And that's just what the money printer does. This is what I discuss in depth in the Fiat Standard. The government can, or the IMF can print money, and it can subsidize the loans for the solar panel and wind turbine factory, and then it'll just it will not subsidize, or it will not lend money to people who want to uh, produce and refine hydrocarbons, or people who want to build um, large power plants. And so this is why I think it's so pernicious, because what's keeping those countries poor is that they don't have energy. And the reason they don't have energy is because they're unable to invest in energy. And the reason they can't invest in energy is because all of the money is being printed and handed out to people investing in completely wasteful and highly damaging forms of energy, which is the modern uh, swings and slides of wind and solar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very true. So it bothers me that we consume so little fossil fuels, so little fossil fuels. When I say so little, I mean, uh, so Africa, with 1.4 billion people, we're consuming about 3.9 million of barrels of oil per day. 3.9 to 4 to 4.1. Let's say 4 million barrels of oil per day. 1.4 billion people. Go to the US. The US has got 330 million people. They're consuming 20 million barrels of oil per day. 20 versus 4. That is like 5 times whatever amount of oil we consume per day. That bothers me a lot. It bothers me. Go to China, 1.4 billion people, they consume about 14 to 16 million barrels of oil per day. Actually, China produces no oil. But what bothers me the most is, as much as we produce our own oil, most of it is going to these Western countries, especially. We have so little left. And so what I'm literally saying is fossil fuels for Africa, and we have our own oil. We don't need. Why should a country like Kenya get oil all the way from the Middle East when we have oil in Nigeria, when we have oil in Egypt, when we have oil in Angola, when we have oil in Libya? It doesn't make sense. Why should Uganda get oil all the way from the Middle East when Uganda has got its own oil? Kenya, we have our own oil, but we're not drilling our own oil because of policies and stuff like that, and especially policies that don't attract investors, energy, fossil fuel investors. Uganda's got its own oil, but it's getting their oil from the Middle East, and it lands in our port, the Mombasa port, the Kenyan port, and then it's shipped to Uganda via trucks or our pipeline. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's ridiculous that this is taking place, and I think there's just so much more capacity for producing um, local oil at a very cheap cost. But there's no investment in it because the economy is to a very large degree controlled by what the IMF dictates, and that brings us nicely to the topic of your president, whom
Yeah.
I've seen you post very affectionately about over the last few weeks. I found, obviously, I'll be honest here. You know, I don't follow Kenyan politics closely. I don't know much about it. So if I do say something that's wrong, please do correct me. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I have noticed a very, very common pattern in Kenya and in many, many countries. And I think this guy, you posted a tweet where you were describing him, and I just thought this is like the poster child of the current third world leader. All over the world, you have these leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and even in Europe as well. I mean, it's becoming similar to that, in that these people are just creatures that are optimized for the IMF. These people are like a creature made for the IMF because the only way to make it in politics in countries where the IMF has a significant presence is that you need to get on the good side of the IMF. Doesn't matter if you are good to people and people can vote for you. If you, no matter how good you are, no matter how people like you, you're not going to stand a chance next to the guy who has the IMF giving him billions of dollars in loans. If you are going to do amazing things for Kenya and you're going to run for president, and a lot of Kenyans appreciate what you are doing, you're not going to stand a chance next to a guy who's going to have billions of dollars from the IMF. If you're going to go and say, we don't want fossil fuel, we don't want to waste our time and money on silly energy sources, we want to invest in hydrocarbons. If you say we're going to try and develop and let people speculate and look for oil and hydrocarbon production, you're going to anger them. And then your opponent is going to have a big, giant amount of money from the IMF that he's going to be ready to spend. He's going to be spending that money on all kinds of projects. And, you know, you need to get money from actual investors and savers. They just have a money printer. And so they can come and subsidize any crazy idea, buy votes, buy constituencies, give different political constituencies the things that they want so that these constituencies will vote for them. And the end result will be that the IMF candidate will win. So this guy seems to me like the perfect poster boy for what the IMF wants. So tell us, what is his story?
So we have President Ruto, William Ruto, one of the most corrupt leaders Kenya has ever seen. So anyway, this guy is all about climate change. He's preaching environmental conservation. Whenever European countries have these big climate convention or meetings, one of the presidents they're going to invite and actually give him like a space to talk, the podium. is William Ruto, because William Ruto is going to say, uh, let's conserve the environment, or let's do something for the planet, and stuff like that. And so even the IMF realizes that. I think that's why. So last year we were supposed to have to get this loan. I don't know what for. The IMF and World Bank told the president, if you want us to give you the loan, you have to do something for the environment. And so we had, it was like on a Thursday or something, the president just announced that on Monday we were going to have a national tree planting day. Every other, so we didn't know about the loan, but every other person was asking, like, why would the government do that? Like everything is going to stand still, no collection of taxes. Why? No jobs, nothing. And we later on came to realize that it was all thanks to the IMF. The IMF told the Kenyan government, do something for the environment if you want us to give you the loan. And that's why we had a national tree planting day. So during the former leaderships, the IMF tried to tell the Kenyan government to end fuel and fertilizer subsidies. The former government used to say no. But last year, we had the government scrap off the fuel and fertilizer subsidies because the IMF told them to do that. And because this president is just corrupt and bribable, he did that. That's why, like, he ended the fuel and fertilizer subsidies. And you can imagine, because like we're not drilling our own oil, we have to get the oil from the Middle East, and we like competing. When we buy oil from these when we buy oil from the Middle East, we're competing with these other countries. We're competing with European countries. We're competing with anyway. We're competing with other countries. We're competing with China, and these are, I'd say, better off countries. They are a bit richer compared to these poor African countries. So somehow energy should be very cheap if we want to flourish as a country or as a continent. So somehow we have to have fuel subsidies. Somehow, because we're getting fertilizer from the Middle East as well, somehow we have to subsidize fertilizer if we want even the poorest people to have access to it. So when the government did that, we didn't like it. But you could clearly see, even in our community, like people were consuming much more cow dung compared to fertilizer, because fertilizer was so expensive. The price of fertilizer has gone up from in 2020 to today. It has gone up by like 2 times, despite the fact that, okay, so currently we have uh, the government subsidizing fertilizer, but it's mostly so people realized that the government wasn't giving us fertilizer. They were giving us soil and rocks. Corrupt government doing dirty deals under Ruto, under the leadership of Ruto, because Ruto is the king of corruption. So Ruto is being used by the IMF. We recently had the finance bill 2024. The finance bill usually it's something. It's like this article or document that aids the government to have a budget. So they say we're going to increase the tax base because that's what the IMF told them. And actually, the IMF told them, if you do that, there's going to be protests, but you can ignore that. That's what the IMF told them, told the government. And the government listened to IMF. And despite the fact that people were saying we shouldn't have a bread tax, we shouldn't have an increase in fuel tax because like we're paying so much for as tax for the fuel, about 40%. We shouldn't have cancer treatment taxed. We shouldn't have we shouldn't tax sanitary pads, the female sanitary pads. We shouldn't tax diapers. We shouldn't have a car tax like every year. Doesn't matter what your car does. The government said we're going to tax your car depending on how much you bought the car at. And then they had like um, an amount, the tax amount. So they had a cap. So they said 5,000 Kenyan shillings, about 50 USD, to 1,000 USD. So the 1,000, because we have very rich politicians, very rich members of parliament, very rich senators and governors, because these people are literally stealing our taxes. So these people, they can afford to buy 400,000 cars. They're traveling with 4,000 cars, and they boost it. Like, we had one of a former member of the government. She bought what is it called? There is this, okay, it's some sort of car. Anyway, it's a fancy car for 400,000 USD. And she was flaunting on social media, on TikTok. She's dancing and saying, "Oh, God gave me this car." And so we have the President Ruto's right hand man is tribesmen. Like, this guy is so tribal. He has employed his lots of his tribe people as government officials in different sectors. And these are people who don't, they lack education. Like, these people never, most of them didn't go past high school. They are so incompetent. They know nothing. Some of them can't even read. Like, one guy during his swearing in, he wouldn't even read the article. The guy is called Oscar Sudi, and the like the most corrupt people. And these people are traveling with like 10 Land Cruisers. Land Cruisers are very expensive. A guy has got just an MP. An MP is traveling with 10 Land Cruisers. He has got lots of a ton of security. Like, what is this guy uh, securing himself from? Because, like, we are his bosses. Anyway, so uh, when the government of Kenya, President Ruto bribed the members of parliament to vote yes, and most of these people voted yes, and so the bill was approved. And that's why people went to the streets. We have the Gen Z, the young people. Now, we don't have a leader. We don't have a leader. We just saying we don't have a leader. It's literally different people. We organizing on Twitter, on TikTok, on Instagram. We're saying the government is doing us wrong. It's playing us. It's not listening to us. It's listening to IMF. We have to do something. And so that's why we have the anti-government protests in Kenya today. People going to the streets saying Ruto must go because Ruto is being used by these Western organizations, the IMF and World Bank. Ruto is being used by the US government because recently he traveled to the US and he met with Biden and he took crazy pictures that you look at and you wonder if this is like a president, because the guy is just sitting on the White House desk like this and Biden is behind him and the guy is just smiling so hard, like he's very happy to be on that chair or in that chair. So, and this guy tweets a lot of stuff. He's talking about Haiti, he's talking about the war in Palestine and Israel, and most of whatever he says doesn't agree with us. Like, most Africans, actually, most Kenyans, and most Africans today, if you ask them about the war in Russia and Ukraine, most are going to side with Russia because Russia has done so much for Africans. If you went to the war in Israel and Palestine, most Africans are going to side with Palestine. But I should say that we don't really engage so much with this, whatever is happening outside Africa. We have a war in Congo. Why shouldn't we be talking about that? Why should we talk about a war happening miles and miles away from Africa? So the guy just is a Western puppet. Let me just say that. And that's why we have the anti-governmental protests happening.
Yeah, I think this is really very telling. I think when I say that this is really an excellent poster child, this is what I mean. Like, it's just you could replace him with a few lines of code that generate these very predictable uh, buzzwords. We must fight climate change. We must support Israel. We must make sure that we are securing uh, American interests in this way or that way. We must make the world safe for democracy. We must do this and this and that. I mean, these are the same buzzwords that you hear from these organizations. And I mean, you look at these people, if you know them closely, if you look at their actions, you know that they don't care about any of that stuff. That the ability to repeat those lines allows them to go from, somebody like this probably has the competence to work as some, middle office manager at some corporation, making a decent salary probably. And then by being able to repeat those lines and getting into politics and connecting with the IMF, this guy's probably now worth tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's yeah, and he's able to command billions of dollars that he can allocate as he wants. So more important than just the money that he makes for himself, the money that he sends to his Swiss bank account, is the money that he can decide how to allocate. So he decides, you are a loyalist to my regime, so you get money for this, you get money for that. And all of that just happens if you unlock the correct buzzwords. Get in, talk about climate change, talk about human rights, talk about American leadership, talk about Israel, talk about all of these, the NPC talking points from Western media. Just repeat whatever it is that the Economist and the New York Times are saying. And if you just repeat those things, and they're very easy, it doesn't require a genius to repeat those noises. It's just, we must prevent climate change from doing bad things. Yay, we must support this and that, and we must stand up for this and this and that. It's very easy to do that, and then you're able to get it to power, and then you're able to uh, have an enormous amount of money. But the really interesting thing here is that, of course, the IMF is constantly marketing itself as this free market institution, that we are going to help Kenya by bringing in free market reforms to Kenya, and we're going to fix the fiscal and monetary situation in Kenya by introducing free market reforms. But then, if you actually look a little deeper on what is actually going on, it's always the IMF imposing more taxes. So they give you loans to pay off the previous loans that they gave you, which you couldn't pay off. And you're in debt. So they give you more debt. And then they put you into more debt into the long term. And how are you going to pay that back? Don't worry, they're going to give you fiscal reforms that are going to allow you to collect enough taxes to pay this back. And so then you are going to see all of these free market political leaders who come in on a platform of, we're going to institute free market reforms. We're going to make the market,
Yeah.
free market. Milton Friedman. Some of them now in the Argentina is even bringing up Rothbard and the Austrians. But what has he done since getting into office? He raised taxes. Why?
Yeah.
Why do you need to raise taxes for a free market institution? The point is to just get rid of all those taxes. If you got rid of taxes, you would be in much better place. And the majority of the taxes aren't going to finance things that are useful for the country. They're not going to finance building infrastructure for the country. They're going to pay off the debts for the IMF. And of course, they're going to pay off the debts of the previous corrupt regimes in places like Kenya and Argentina, but also they're going to pay off the debts that are taken off by this corrupt regime. So it's always the same scam, which is here. Here's $5 billion. Here's $3 billion. Here's $300 million, or here's $10 billion, whatever number it is that the IMF can give you. Here's this amount of money. Take it, and then we need you to tax your people so that you can pay us back. And this is somehow going to fix the economy. We're going to saddle everybody in the society with decades of debt, where they're going to need to keep paying for things that we are building today. And supposedly under the notion that the things that we're building today are going to be better. But what are the things that they're building today? Solar panels that are going to fall apart in a few years, and they're not going to provide enough electricity. Water treatment plants that are running on solar panels or wind turbines that are going to be extremely expensive and unreliable and require enormous amounts of maintenance. All of that, when we have very reliable and very cheap ways of doing these things reliably, but they don't want to do that. There is almost an advantage to making sure that the businesses don't work, because then the debt slaves are in more trouble. If you actually invested in something that was good, then they might be able to pay off some of that debt. You don't want that. You don't want them to pay off the debt. You want the country desperate, begging the IMF for another bailout, so that then you can go and impose whatever terms you want on it. And so that then the IMF can use its loan as a way to get leverage on the government to get whatever they want. So whether it's votes in the United Nations Security Council, or building military bases, or opening up for international corporations to come and have preferable access. And so, one of the funny things they do, well, it's not funny, it's tragic, is they'll raise taxes on everybody in Kenya, say, because we need to pay back the loan, but also we need to encourage investment. And so, how do we encourage investment? How do we encourage foreign investment? We give tax breaks for foreign investors who come into the country. So Kenyan investors have to pay higher taxes because somebody needs to pay back Shylock at the IMF, and then foreign investors can come in and not have to pay taxes in Kenya because we want to attract capital. So it works wonderfully for everybody involved except for the Kenyan people.
Yeah.
It works great for the people in charge of Kenya, the government and his cronies. Now they have all, you mentioned all of the cars and all of the amazing amounts of money that is made. It works great for the IMF bureaucrats who get to assign this enormous amount of money to this country. They come in to the nicest five-star hotels in Kenya, spend months hanging out at the pool and the beach, and assigning all of that money. It works great for the multinational corporations that work with the IMF and the World Bank and use the World Bank and the IMF as a way to enter these countries and not have to pay taxes. And it works well for the US government, which continues to use its fake printed money to get whatever national interest. Well, it's not even national interest, it's all special interest bullshit. No, but the US doesn't really have any interest in anything happening in Kenya. The best thing that could happen to Kenya for the US is for Kenyans to be rich and prosperous and to be able to produce things for Americans, to be able to buy things from Americans. But again, special interests have different benefits from this.
Yeah. Somebody said the US doesn't want war to end. It's in for endless wars. It just wants endless wars, and that is the US government, because we have people in the US who really care about whatever is happening elsewhere or outside their country. And anyway, that's why I like a country like China. Whenever the Chinese, when so I'm comparing the devil versus the devil or something of the sort. So we have the Chinese giving us loans. The Chinese come here. A good example is whatever happened in Kenya. They came to Kenya. They built the standard gauge rail from Mombasa, our port, to our capital city, Nairobi. And the railway is working despite the fact that we've came to realize that the government spent so much money on that particular project, so much money. Most of that went to these corrupt politicians' pockets. And once they get the money, they buy properties in Switzerland or in the US and stuff like that, and they live rich. So another example, we have we have an expressway in Kenya, and the expressway is built by the Chinese. Like, we have the Chinese doing a lot of good work over here. Whenever they give us a loan, we can see what the loan did, despite that it. So their loans are cheaper compared to the Western loans, at 2.7% interest compared to like 4% or something. We can see whatever the Chinese loan did. We can't see what the IMF loans do. We can't see what they do. So whenever we're repaying, a good example, like whenever we're repaying the SGR loan, we can see that we can use the SGR, but we can't see what the IMF loan did. We're just paying. So there is a guy called Jimmy Wanjigi, and he ran for president, I think, in 2017 or something. He lost, but the guy knows so much about economics and whatever is happening in Kenya. And so we had a space on Twitter recently, and he was addressing the Gen Z, the people who are out there protesting for their rights and uh, against the IMF and this corrupt president. And he was saying, like, he said a lot of crazy stuff that most people didn't know, because the guy has been in contact with the government, the executive, and he's asking for receipts and, the auditing stuff. So our president today is talking about expanding the tax base so that we can pay off the loans, the debts that we owe the IMF and World Bank. But most of the taxes collected are going to pay for the loan. But when you look at, so from Jimmy Wanjigi, the guy says that we owe nobody any money, because like when you look at the receipts, you don't see where the money went. The money is just crazy stuff. So the IMF and World Bank are out there to ensure that we never develop the biggest economic hitman that Africa is facing today. IMF, World Bank, and the UN.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently. Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I think this is really telling. And just last week, we had a couple of weeks ago, we had a podcast episode with Arnaud Bertrand, which is posted on the podcast now. And in it, we discussed China. He's a Frenchman, but he lives in China. He's been an entrepreneur in China for a very long time. And it's very common to hear all kinds of horrible things about the Chinese government and what China is doing in Africa and how China is destroying African societies by taking advantage of them and building horrible things like seaports and hospitals and infrastructure. But I think, as you said, there is a clear difference between the way that they invest. So they come and they're not trying to tell you, they're not trying to use you to fix the weather. They're not like these primitive tribes of the West who think that you can control the temperature of Earth by making Kenyans more poor. They just build infrastructure, and I think this is becoming more and more clear to people. People initially, I think, for somebody like me, when you hear about China is building infrastructure in Africa, initially you immediately suspect it's going to be similar to what the US is doing in that IMF debt slavery and building all kinds of projects and then using it to build military bases and interfere in these governments, take down local regimes and replace them with Chinese puppets regimes that are going to rob the country to benefit the Chinese regime and its cronies. But it seems like it's different, right?
Yeah, I personally feel it's different. So the Chinese are building our hospitals, they're building government infrastructure, be it like maybe if you need a parliament or something of the sort, they're building roads, they're building railway lines, they're building hydro, they're building HEP, hydroelectric power plants in Africa. Like they're doing a lot of good stuff. And the Chinese are not telling us stop, care about the environment or do that sustainably, or like they're not preaching that. The Chinese, I personally think the Chinese might have our best interest at heart. Of course, with the US sanctioning, and maybe in a few months or a few years, European sanctioning, China is going to need a place where they can sell their products, because China is basically largely a manufacturing country. So they want. I personally feel that the Chinese might want us to develop so that they can have a place where they can sell their products. That's what I personally feel. So whenever I say this, most of the people in the West don't. They tell me China is just using you and stuff like that. But I feel China is a bit different from, like, when you compare China with the IMF and World Bank. These are two different organizations. One is doing the actual stuff, they building stuff that you can see. So whenever you repay a loan, you can see that we are repaying a loan for an SGR railway that is working. It's working. When you pay back an IMF loan, you don't know what the money did. And the money that the debt came, the loan came with economic reforms, these policies that end fossil fuel, end fertilizer subsidies, end fuel subsidies. Crazy reforms that don't promote development in these African developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I should say I'm not a fan of subsidies for fuel and fertilizer. I
I know.
think it would be better not to have those things. But I think there are many ways in which the government is taking money from people, and so if you just reduce the amount of taxation that they impose, then you wouldn't need to do all of these subsidies. I think the less intervention in all of these markets, the better would be the outcome. That's the way that I see it. But I think the real issue continues to be all of the debt that the government needs to take up to pay off the IMF. I mean, once you really look at this over time, it's very difficult to give it any kind of charitable interpretation. They, as you said, they build a bunch of white elephant projects that fail, that fall apart, but the debt stays forever. So they have a crazy idea about let's electrify this village with wind farms. They spend a lot of money on wind farms, which you could spend on building an actual, real, useful power plant. And then the wind farm falls apart, but the debt remains, and you need to pay it. And then the debt gets rolled over, and it keeps accumulating more and more interest. And then when you can't repay it, they give you an even bigger loan. And it's in a place like Germany, Germany spends tens of billions of dollars every year on subsidizing solar and wind. And Germany is a rich, or at least it was a rich country. It's now working its way towards poverty more and more, but because of these insanities. But this has been an extremely expensive thing that they can sort of afford because they're rich, but you can't really afford this insanity if you're poor. You just end up with an enormous amount of taxes being piled up on people, which is going to continue to make things, I believe, worse and worse and worse. And that's why I think really Bitcoin is such a big deal, because Bitcoin is a form of money that allows you to be independent of the IMF, both as an individual and as a government. A Kenyan government that stacks sats, that buys Bitcoin, will have a form of money that appreciates with time. And so its money isn't, because the money isn't constantly depreciating, you don't need to keep borrowing. When your money is the dollar is losing value every year. So in order for you to continue to operate, you can't use your savings. You have to run down your savings. You have to run on a very little amount of cash balances and keep borrowing to finance major expenses. It's true at an individual level, and it's true at a national level. And so you become a debt slave. And so you become completely beholden to whoever it is that is lending you the money. And this is where we see the world going. I think only Bitcoin fixes this.
Yeah, I agree. So last year I flew to South Africa and I had cash. I had Kenyan shillings. So about 150 Kenyan shilling, 150 USD in Kenyan shillings. So I went there and I landed at the airport. I was waiting for a friend, and I had Kenyan shillings, but I couldn't do anything with it. I was like moving from shop to shop, asking if they can if they can exchange my Kenyan shillings to South African rand, and nobody will do that. Like they don't recognize the Kenyan shilling, despite the fact that Kenya and in South Africa are friends. But if I had USD, if I had euros, I would have found an exchange place. So another time I went there, I had Bitcoin, and that was a bit easier because with Bitcoin you just land there and you can convert uh, the Bitcoin to rand easily. Last year I was working on these particular projects back here at home, community projects, and getting funding from the US was a big challenge. Like I'd have to go to the bank, and the guy wouldn't be able to send me the funds. Like he had to go to the bank. He tried sending by himself, but he was told you have to go to the bank in case like this Kenyan guy is maybe wants to steal from you. So you have to come to the bank by yourself. So you have your own money, but you realize that you don't own it. You have to go to the bank for the bank to officialize the transaction. So he went to the bank, he sent me the funds. I had to wait like almost 2 weeks for the funds to arrive here. And when the funds arrive here, I have to go to the bank, explain to them what the funds are for. A lot of official stuff involved. Now with Bitcoin, at the moment I'm helping my community get connected to the grid, and somebody sent me funds from elsewhere, like immediately, like in a span of 10 minutes, I have the funds. And in a span of maybe 5 minutes, I have the funds in Kenyan shillings if I want to. So I personally feel that Bitcoin can solve our currency problems, because like even at the moment, if I went to Uganda is like in my immediate neighbor. Uganda is about 50 or so kilometers from here, from where I live. But if I went to Uganda today, the Ugandans don't take the Kenyan shilling. I have to exchange my Kenyan shillings to Ugandan shillings. So even trading with these countries is a big problem. But with Bitcoin is international. Like one Bitcoin is equal, one Bitcoin in Kenya is equal to one Bitcoin in Uganda, and like it's so easy. It's so fast. So I think Bitcoin has got uh, is a solution to is a part of the solution to our problems.
Yeah, no, I think so. I agree. I think 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's going to be one of the craziest things that we try and explain to our grandkids, how your money stopped working when you got on an airplane. I mean, just it's such a ridiculous idea. Your phone keeps working, your pencil, your pen works, and then this piece of paper suddenly stops being money because you got on an airplane and you went to a place where it doesn't work as money. But why should money stop working when you cross an imaginary line in the sand? And it loses an enormous amount of its value when you cross a country with it, and you need to exchange it into something else. I think it's completely ridiculous, and it's inevitable in my mind that the world's going to head toward one money, and that money is going to have to be something that's neutral. It can't be a form of money that is controlled by a government, because this is the driver of all of the problems that we currently have, and it's an enormous burden on the world, as I discuss in my books. And it's simply being able to remove the ability of the people who issue that money of creating more and more of that money to finance themselves at our expense is going to make the world so much better. I mean, just to go back to the issue of the power plant, the really perverse thing here to remember is that the reason that the IMF is able to bring in so much money to finance all of these um, unworkable forms of power plants at the expense of the power plants that work, the reason that Kenyan entrepreneurs can't build coal and electricity plants, and instead of being stuck with wind or solar, and not just in Kenya, is because in all of those countries, people's money is constantly being devalued because the dollar is being devalued. So everybody all over the world is holding dollars. Everybody all over the world is constantly losing purchasing power in the dollars that they hold. And that purchasing power is going to the people who are able to print that money. And that includes the IMF, who effectively create that money out of thin air because they have a credit line from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is able to make more money, and it's robbing everybody from Kenya to China to India to Brazil, all over the world. Everybody's constantly getting robbed in order to create more dollars. And then those dollars come to you, and they build these power plants that are wasteful, that get you into debt. It's such a perverse system. And the only way to break out of it, in my mind, is Bitcoin.
My brother made a great observation after I shared with him about my travel to South Africa. So he has a friend. So anyway, he has a friend, and January last year, the 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 price of so anyway, we have the youth. Like the first thing you do after you leave school, you want to build your own house. That's what we all of us want. It doesn't matter. It could be a small structure, but it's yours. So you want to move away from your parents' house. So that's the first thing that people around here want to do. The youth around here want to do. They want to have their own house. So that means that you have to buy iron sheets. Last year, so my brother observed that last year, in one of those merry-go-rounds, we have chamas. We refer to them as chamas. A chama is a thing. It's a thing whereby like you have you. Okay, so we are a group of people. We come together. Let's say we are a group of 10 people. We come together and then we have a basket. You give out your each and every other person is going to give out, let's say, $10 every other month. And then, so the first month we give it to you, the second month we give it to somebody else. That way, that's how people save. It's a good way of saving. So that's what happens around here a lot. So somebody was given money in January, and with the money they bought iron sheets for their house to build their house. In December, the last member of that chama was given money, and they could only buy half of the how half the number of iron sheets that the person who bought half the number of iron sheets as the person who bought the iron sheets in January. So the price of iron sheets had gone up by like 2 times in a span of 12 months or something. And yeah, it paints a sad picture. Like you think you're saving, but at the end of the year, you cannot. You can only buy half. You can only afford half of the initial value. It's sad. So yeah, I totally relate to that.
Yeah, it's sad, and it's really ultimately the most important thing that is making people poor, in my mind. I mean, it's just people continue to think about all of the terrible things that the government is doing and how the government should be doing this and the government should be doing that. They should tax this. No, they shouldn't tax that. Ultimately, all of that is secondary in my mind to the money that is being destroyed. If your money is losing value, everything is being undermined. It's like you're trying to build a house on quicksand. Everything that you try and build is going to fall apart. All of your money is constantly losing its value, and you're just constantly getting poorer. And it's just been so normalized. But I think, imagine how different the world would be if, I mean, I'm not very familiar with the Kenyan monetary history, but I presume you must have had several inflations and several probably hyperinflations over the last 50 years or so, and money is constantly declining and constantly losing value. So imagine if the average Kenyan person didn't have uh, to use this horrific money that is constantly losing value next to the dollar, which is itself losing value. And instead, Kenyans had had the last 50 years a form of money that appreciates every year at around 2%. So fixed supply or low supply growth rate. And so the value of the money continues to increase at around 1 or 2 or 3% per year. Just imagine how different life would be. So the things that your father saved 30 years ago today would be would be worth a lot more. Life would be very, very different. Everything that we talk about in terms of the quality of life would be very, very different if people were able to keep their wealth. It's very sad.
Yeah, it's sad.
I'm going to look up the exchange rate of the Kenyan shilling and see how it's done over the long term. Do you recall any hyperinflations in your life?
Yeah, okay, so I like never really worried about the dollar and versus the Kenyan shilling, but I know from 2016, I think 2016 a dollar was trading at at maybe 90 shillings. Actually, for the okay, so for like in the past maybe 30 years, the dollar has been trading from in between 80 something Kenyan shillings to 90 Kenyan shillings. That has been like the average, 80 to 90 Kenyan shillings. Until most recently, when the dollar just went up from like 100 or something, or 110, where it had stayed for maybe 2 3 years, and then it just went up to 160. But we came to realize that that was thanks to the IMF. The IMF devalued, told the government to, or somehow did something to devalue the Kenyan shilling. The IMF did that, and so today the dollar is back at 120 something, 125 to 130. That is where it should be. Actually, it should be a bit lower, but now that's the market determining how much. a dollar is trading at, compared to what was happening last year. The IMF was controlling how much a dollar was trading at.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the chart now.
Mhm.
10 years ago, in July 2014, it was at around 86, as you were saying. So in 10 years, we've gone from 86 to 130. So about 40% devaluation in the Kenyan shilling against the dollar, which has, over the last 10 years, I would say probably a 40% devaluation in real purchasing power is probably an accurate assessment of what has happened to the dollar. I think 10 years, 40% is probably accurate, maybe even higher. But yeah, that's so. Can you imagine 40% against another 40%?
Yeah,
If you had money in a Kenyan bank 10 years ago, if it's still there and if the bank is still there, which is a big if, always with fiat banks, it's worth a lot less than what it was worth back then. It's worth
yeah,
60%
sure.
of 60%, so something like 36% of what it was worth in terms of real purchasing power. And you can see this if you look, if you compare it to the price of real goods and services, like price of land, price of homes. So a nice apartment in Kenya, if you look at what has happened to the price of a nice apartment in Kenya over the last 10 years, I'd be surprised if it has not doubled at least. It should have maybe even tripled. Who knows?
Yeah, that is very true.
Yeah. All right. Jasper, can you tell us more about your work and where people can find you? You also you're on Twitter, but where else? And what is your handle on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Jasper Machogu. I'm on Substack, jaspermachogu.substack.com. Yeah, so I'm all about fossil fuels for Africa. I'm advocating for energy for Africans. I'm not just talking about energy, I'm also talking about the four pillars of modern civilization. I'm talking about plastics, I'm talking about cement and steel, and most especially, I'm talking about fertilizer. Because where I come from, we all about agriculture. And I want the average African to be better, to be fed, to beat poverty. And despite what you might hear from in the mainstream media, people saying the world is burning up, wildfires and stuff like that, just look at the data. The data shows a different picture. It paints a different picture, a totally different picture. This is the best time for you and I to be alive. Even as Africans, even as today we have a few Africans starving, maybe 1 in 5 or something of the sort, or 1 in 3 are very poor. This this is the best time to be alive. Don't listen to the mainstream media, and it's the best time to be alive thanks to the benefits of fossil fuels. Leave alone, when you look at the picture, just look at the positives and the negatives. The bigger picture shows that every other thing is better thanks to fossil fuels, and that's what my people lack. We lack fossil fuels. We have our own fossil fuels. I'm not saying give us aid, I'm saying we need investors to invest in our fossil fuels. Let's drill that. Let's drill our oil. Let's tap into our natural gas. Let's mine our coal. Let's use that to better our lives. That is literally it. So yeah, fossil fuels for Africa.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for what you're doing. It is really inspiring, and I hope more and more people in Africa and all over the world listen to what you have to say. And I hope more and more people start using more and more of these amazing fuels that have given us such an amazing life and stop vilifying them, because it doesn't make you look cool or smart to think that you are going to change the weather by keeping people poor. It's going to make you poor eventually if you keep believing those things. So get rid of these silly superstitious beliefs. You do not control the weather. It's more important for you to secure your own survival and secure the survival of your children and your family and your friends. And for that, you're going to need high powered fuels. So thank you so much, Jasper.
Thank you.
And we'll be posting, I should say, we'll be posting your links, the links that you mentioned. And also, you've got a Bitcoin wallet where if people want to support your work, they can donate to Jasper Machogu at walletofsatoshi.com.
Yeah,
So we'll be posting that in the show notes. Thanks again.
thank you for having me.
Cheers.